Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Background Noise. I'm Peter Snyder, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Andrew Brotherton and Ryan Watterson. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing suicide culture, particularly on the internet, and what it really means. To start us off, I'm just going to hand the mic over to Andrew, and he's just going to give us a little bit of insight into this topic and just sort of tell us what we mean to speak about today. Over to you, Andrew.
Our society's prevailing social attitudes have the effect of normalizing or trivializing suicide and mental health issues. One might call this a suicide culture. The internet in particular is the perfect place for a culture like this to manifest. Dark humor comes easier from people when they can hide behind a username or even completely anonymously. However, dark humor was mostly kept to the corners of the web. Over the last few years, jokes about nihilism, existentialism, mental health, suicide, and other such related topics have been hitting the mainstream. I began my search for an explanation on Facebook. Facebook pages have long been an ideal place for sharing content under one brand. Meme pages in particular thrive in this environment. Pages like Chair Memes have a clear theme and post and share content about that specific content. Of course, pages about darker subject matter eventually began to emerge. Pages like Nihilist Memes or Depression Memes have garnered nearly 1.7 million and 430,000 likes respectively. There is an obvious market for content like this, but an explanation remains unclear as to why it exists. One popular theory is that those struggling with issues such as these may be the same audience spending lots of time online, leading them to bond together with others in the same position of them over humor about said issues. A coping method, if you will. I decided to talk to a psychologist about this to hear a professional opinion. Interestingly enough, she revealed to me that self-deprecating humor, especially among youth, was a growing trend as a coping method. Now, whether or not it's a healthy one is to be determined, as the rise in suicide culture postdates the most recent statistics from Stats Canada. But similarly to how one may joke about a horror movie to make it less scary, it is possible that humor does some good in this situation. By making the villain more human, it makes it easier for us to understand and cope with it, and the same might be said about self-deprecating humor. However, the main issue is not these pages. Sure, self-deprecating humor may be unhealthy, but people coming together from different parts of the world to discuss and deal with personal issues can't be all that bad. The real issue with suicide culture stems from more widespread overuse of mental health for hyperbole. 3-4 years ago, suicide as hyperbole was frowned upon, if not taken extremely seriously, and landing you in the hospital for a mandatory 72-hour stay. Nowadays, telling your friends you want to kill yourself because of the test tomorrow is commonplace. Even tweeting that you'd rather get hit by a bus than go to school is standard. It's this dependence on mental health issues for hyperboles that might be causing real issues. Our trivial usage of what are some people's day-to-day struggles may be undermining those that face these obstacles every day. Even worse is our usage of phrases like kill yourself. Phrasing an insult as seriously like this can deal the most damage. Because of the invisible struggle that depression is, saying something like this can cause real harm to some people who will take it much more seriously than you intend it to. Because of a complete lack of data from 2013 and onwards, we lack the hard evidence to identify the exact impacts of the words we use, and therefore we can't draw a conclusion on what we've learned so far. That's why today we're going to be discussing our jokes, our exaggerations, and where we draw the line on this kind of humor.
Thanks, Andrew. Alright, so to better help us understand our topic, we found someone with an opinion on this subject. Introducing David White.
Hey.
Alright, David, it's good having you here today. How are you?
Good.
That's good. Just before we get to the meat of the interview, can you tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a grade 11 student at William Lyon Mackenzie, and I'm currently in the Max program.
Alright. So, today we're going to be discussing the prevalence of suicide jokes in our culture. How do you feel about this topic?
I'm kind of impartial to it, I guess.
Do you know many people that tend to make jokes making fun of or referencing suicide?
Yeah, a lot of my friends, including me, tend to make jokes on the subject.
So would you say that this is generally a negative influence on you and your friends, positive influence?
Honestly, I don't think it really influences people much in a negative way. I think it's either positive or no impact at all because, like, if you're not really suicidal and people are making suicide jokes, it's not going to affect you much. But if you are suicidal, if you're joking around it and your friends are also joking about it, it's oddly therapeutic in a way. Kind of makes you feel like you're not alone or something. I don't know.
So what you're saying is a lot of people make these jokes to sort of confess these feelings that they're having without any risk of social stigma?
Well, yeah. Sometimes I'd say it would be that, and then other times I think it's also because people, or at least people that I don't think have depression, I don't personally know, also make jokes. I think it's just, I don't know. It's just the culture nowadays.
So, from what of many of the things that I've seen, do you feel like these jokes cause suicide cliques to form around this idea of haha crippling depression?
I mean, with sort of any sort of behavior and any subject, you're going to have groups formed around that certain subject, and I think this is just would just be another example where people who feel similar are going to form groups with each other to be around people that they feel like they're a part of.
So, being in groups like this, do you think this would sort of cause a sort of hive mind mentality, a sort of echo chamber sort of thing? A person would feel like they're part of this group and they wouldn't actually want to get their issues addressed because they feel like this is part of their identity?
So you mean like they might want to stay depressed as a I guess that could be a potential negative side effect of groups like this, where if you don't want to leave a certain group you're associated with, you wouldn't want to leave your identity, so to speak.
All right. So, do you think that people making these jokes and talking about this sort of thing, would this desensitize like those people that might be able to help them with these feelings, with their problems? Would this desensitize those people to going to these conversations? It would make them seem like, haha, it's just a joke, when it's actually cry for help?
I mean, I think to a certain extent you can always, or, well, I'd like to think you could tell whether or not something's a joke as opposed to a legitimate cry for help. But I think it's certainly a possibility that if you have a bunch of jokes going around, that a legitimate cry for help could be sort of lost in the noise.
So just to go back to something I asked earlier, a lot of people would seem to use these jokes as a sort of confession sort of thing to talk about their issues without any actual, like, without any, like, risk of social stigma, like I said before. Do you think that other people, it sort of, with that, would these groups sort of drown out those other people with actual issues?
I feel like the thing is with the groups making jokes about suicide, the majority of them are people with thoughts, like legitimate thoughts relating to the jokes that they're making. And by making those jokes, they can get it out, and the other people sort of know that it's a serious topic, but they can use sort of humor as a coping mechanism to sort of get through it.
So do you feel this is more of a natural progression of humor? It's a sort of progression of these people which have those issues. They talk about and they support each other within that community.
I'd say yeah. Like comedy, sort of with any subject, can be made into something comedic as a way of sort of showing support and helping people out. And I think this is just another example of that.
So, do you think there's no problem with this? Like, there's no problem with making these jokes? Nothing like that? It's sort of just a natural sort of thing that shouldn't be disregarded. It shouldn't be discouraged. It's not a problem at all.
I wouldn't say it's not a problem at all. Like, it certainly can help, but it can also be detrimental, as with sort of any form of comedy. If you can, or any form of humor, if someone can't really tell whether or not you're joking, it can always become detrimental. For example, there's certain comedians like to make racist jokes, whatever, but tongue-in-cheek, and their audience knows that it's tongue-in-cheek, but it can be harmful to people if they don't know it's tongue-in-cheek. So, especially with something like this, it could likely be detrimental, where people might interpret some things as comedy when they aren't, or interpret things seriously when they're actually comedy.
So, do you think there's any steps that need to be taken to sort of, like, discourage making these jokes, or to, like, mitigate the risks of it having a harmful effect?
I don't think the jokes should be like squashed out, because I think they do have a certain positive effect, but people should be like, as with sort of any sort of ironic humor, I guess, people need to be educated sort of on the subject to know when it's humor and when it's serious.
All right. Thanks for talking with me today.
Yes, thanks both of you, but especially big shout out to David for taking time out of his day to come down to the studio and talk to us. Great having you. To wrap up this episode, Peter's going to be discussing with us about where we draw the line with this kind of humor.
All rational people agree that suicide is bad, but people still joke about it. When you think about it, there's no need or even logical reason to make these jokes. As Andrew points out, joking about this subject desensitizes us to the real issue, so why do people still make these jokes? Well, the easy answer is that the people who are making these jokes aren't really considering suicide themselves, and they therefore have no problem making jokes about it, and that does make a bit of sense. The classic, "I want to kill myself," can be heard honestly anywhere these days because it's an easy and socially acceptable hyperbole that we use to characterize feelings of failure. We never assume that we're doing any harm by making these jokes, and even if we are conscious of the dangers, we often do it anyways just because everyone else is doing it and we want to fit in. So we know why people make suicide jokes, but can we really rationalize it? Can we assign an acceptable reason to suicide jokes? Well, surprisingly, there are some potential arguments. As the almighty lord of dark humor, iDubbbz, once pointed out, if you say something enough times, it becomes meaningless within a group of people that you say it to. Take the word literally, for example. It was used so much, meaning something other than its original meaning, that it lost what it was supposed to be. The same goes for various slurs, the N-word, the term gay, these jokes about suicide. All of them are used very often in contexts that have nothing to do with their original meaning, that they're taking on new meanings and are often completely harmless to the people that they're said to. For new meanings that are, for example, assume no one in this room is considering suicide. I can't confirm if this is true or not. I certainly hope it isn't. If I say to this room, though, "Oh man, this English ISP was so hard I felt like killing myself," chances are this doesn't actually get anybody thinking about suicide. Rather, your first thoughts more likely are, "Wow, Peter must have had a hard time with this project." Obviously, this doesn't mean it's always okay to make these jokes. If someone who's already having thoughts about suicide hears about it, trivializing it and not taking it seriously, they could be pushed closer to taking their own life. Logically, this means we should just only make suicide jokes with people that we know aren't considering suicide, and we should be fine. But suicide and depression don't work like that. Very rarely would people just admit that they're considering suicide, even if asked, so there's no way to know if we're just making harmless jokes or actually having serious consequences for other people. Honestly, I don't think there really is a proper answer here. It would be nice for no one to make these jokes, but they're already so ingrained in society that I don't see an easy way to just stop people from making them, especially considering the backlash you see on the internet about free speech and comedy versus reality whenever someone tries to ban suicide jokes within a community. I guess the best advice I could offer people is to just not be jerks. If you want to make jokes in private with friends you know well, I'm not going to be mad. But don't do it on a public forum on the internet, because there you never know who could see what you say. Comedy is fine. Maybe there's a future where we're past all of this and there's no problem making jokes. Maybe there's a future where everyone has stopped making these jokes and humor has moved on. I'm not going to oppose either future. But I just ask that people consider how what you say affects others at an individual level, and to not take what you say for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That just about wraps up this episode of Background Noise. I hope you've all enjoyed listening. Tune in next week, same time, same day, and we'll be discussing the TSB dress code. We'll see you then.